Hi, I'm Ellen Kuras, and I'm a director cinematographer.
Hello, and welcome to Art, the podcast where we get to know women from around the world of visual arts. I'm Chris Stafford, and this is Season 3, Episode 23. My guest this week is the multi-award-winning Oscar-nominated American director and cinematographer Ellen Kuras, whose credits include Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, where she was the cinematographer, The Betrayal, Narracoon, where she was director, producer, screenwriter, and cinematographer, and most recently, her dramatic directorial feature debut, Lee. Ellen is an unprecedented 3-time winner of the Cinematography Award for a Dramatic Film for Swoon in 1992, Angela 1995, and Personal Velocity 2002. In 2022, she was the first woman cinematographer to win the American Society of Cinematographers Lifetime Achievement Award. Ellen was born in New Jersey in 1959, where her father was an avionics engineer and her mother a homemaker. She graduated from Brown University with a double BA degree in anthropology and semiotics, while also taking classes in photography and film at the Rhode Island School of Design. She then started her career in the film industry in 1987 in New York as a camera assistant and film electrician, while pursuing a master's degree at night at New York University. The Betrayal, Narracoon, which follows a family from war-torn Laos who were forced to flee and then adapt to life in America, was conceived as her master's thesis, for which she won a Primetime Best Documentary Emmy. She won her second Primetime Emmy for Jane in 2018. Ellen has collaborated with such great directors as Michel Gondry, Spike Jonze, Spike Lee, and Martin Scorsese on features like Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, Blow, He Got Game, Pretend It's a City, and Killers of the Flower Moon. Ellen represents the cinematographer's branch on the Academy of Motion Pictures Arts and Sciences Board of Governors and has served as the ASC ICG representative on the National Film Preservation Board. Ellen has most recently directed for a new heist TV series, 12-12-12, for Apple TV, and the TV series Scarpetta with Nicole Kidman, Ariana DeBose, and Jamie Lee Curtis for Amazon Prime Video. Ellen lives in New York. Ellen, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for taking time to do this.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure. I love your work.
Busy would be just an understatement for you. You've had quite the year, haven't you?
Yes, I haven't been home really at all because a year ago I released the film Lee, which I directed, which is about Lee Miller starring Kate Winslet. And the film went, all over the world. So we were very busy with that. And I've been all over the world working. I work primarily now as a director. I've been doing a lot of series work. And also I still shoot occasionally for certain directors that I know and love, like Spike Lee and Marty Scorsese.
I'm wondering if by any chance you can share what you're working on this year.
I just finished doing a series. I did a block of a series called 12-12-12, which is a new Apple series coming out. Probably next year we'll see the first pilot starring Anthony Mackie and Jamie Dornan. And then I also worked on Scarpetta, which was another series which is coming out starring Nicole Kidman, Ariana DeBose, and Jamie Lee Curtis. So 3 Academy Award-winning actresses all in the same series, which was really so much fun to work on. So exciting. And it's a great story.
That's a lot of high energy, I would think, right there.
Right there. And, it's very interesting because I come from the world of cinematography. So one thing that cinematographers don't often get privy to is how do you speak to actors to get them to go where you want them to go? So it's been a learning curve for me. ever since I started directing narrative, which was, God, probably about 10 years ago now that I started. I was asked to shoot a pilot, and I couldn't shoot it, but they said, can we pick your brain for an hour just about the ideas? Because it was very much about the collective unconscious. And I'm very intellectual when I approach movies, and I get very much into the ideas and the meaning of what something is about and how you can visually express that. So they wanted to kind of pick my brain about, how would you see this show? So we sat there and we had dinner for 3 hours. And then 6 months later, they called me and they said, would you like to direct 2 of the episodes? And that was kind of my entry into the world of narrative, which was great because when I started many, many years ago, when I wanted to be a filmmaker, I wanted to be a filmmaker. I wasn't thinking, I want to be a cinematographer. I wanted to make films. I wanted to make films that had meaning, films that would affect people and move people in the world and have import about what was going on at the time or be a reflection of history. And so, I started making this film. I decided I would go and get my master's at NYU after I had already gotten my BA at Brown. And I thought, well, I'm in New York, I'm starting to work. I might as well just take some classes and see if I can get my master's as well. Might as well. So I did all the coursework and I started making this film, which was supposed to be for a thesis project. And I was really interested in, again, history and politics and how they intersect with the personal. So I was interested in this family whose father had worked for the CIA during the war in Laos. And now looking in retrospect, one can see how the American foreign policy at the time was very much about hiring other people in their own countries to fight our wars for us. And I think that people now see that much more because of the Afghani situation. And so I worked on the film for a long time and found that it was really difficult to make that film because the U.S. has never admitted that we fought a war in Laos. We weren't supposed to have any ground troops, so the U.S. ended up going by air and fighting a secret air war. And they never admitted it. Even to this day, we haven't admitted that we fought a war there, yet there were thousands and millions of refugees that came out of that country and that are living here. And people, they were, in a way, their identity was at stake. It's like, well, why are we here? And people would ask them, why are you here? But the U.S. hadn't admitted that we fought a war there, but they used a lot of those men to be on the ground and to take the brunt. So we've all heard about the Hmong, guerrilla army that the United States started in Laos. And we basically owned their military, much like we did in Afghanistan. So, for me, the question was, how do you tell a story about a political situation and still make it personal? So telling the personal then in the overview of the historical political. And I felt I faced that same question when I went to go do Lee years and years later, and I think we all kind of look at that as like, how do you bring people and audiences to a story that affects them emotionally, that you can identify with the character? So we're seeing more films come out now, more and more, that have to do with, the political situation and having a character that takes us through that. So that's what I did many years ago, but it took me a long time to make that film because I couldn't access any archival footage. The country was classified. So Laos was a classified country. All of the archives in Washington were classified. The National Archives, I couldn't see any films, propaganda films that the U.S. made because they were classified. So how do you make a film? I had to wait to see if I could get some footage and I ended up making my own footage, which is the personal experience of the character when he's escaping Laos. So I recreated that in the spirit of the truth. So it's still a documentary, but it's but it was in the spirit of the truth. It got to the emotional truth. So anyway, after 20 years, when Afghanistan was happening, I went back and said, I have to finish this film. I got really busy. I was working as a cinematographer. That's how I became a cinematographer. People saw what I was doing on that film and they said, oh, will you shoot for me? So I ended up becoming a cinematographer because they could see that I understood meaning and metaphor and how to create meaning with the images. So we went back and finished that film, and then I won the Primetime Emmy for it, and I got nominated for an Academy Award for that film. And it goes to show you, if you haven't finished something, still keep faith in it, because if you go back to it, you don't know what's going to happen with it. As long as it has something to say, something meaningful to say, people will hear you.
Well, you certainly portrayed that with Lee, as you said. Talk about truth, political truth, and they're a hidden story for so long. And there are many of those too, but it speaks to how you are all about the truth. You mentioned this to me before we started recording, Ellen, and I see this in your work very much so, that the nuances of truth now, which has become a precious gemstone today.
Yes. Well, I mean, as we know, one of the first moves of the present administration back in 2016 by our current president, was to question the truth and to basically say, oh, that's fake news. Therefore, I'm telling you the truth. So that was a device that was set up that the Nazis used, that Hitler used, basically to question the truth. That is a 101 playbook rule. Make people question what's actually reality. So you're saying, I'm telling you the reality, so believe me. And that's the basis of propaganda. Yeah. And what we're seeing today is that propaganda on the internet, because it's very easy to put lies up on the internet, to talk about lies. Before, people used to say, that's not true. Mm-hmm. And they would fact check. But that seems to have gone out the window because of this propaganda that people are believing. And people no longer are going to go and check and fact check, and they're not being checked. As we learned when I was growing up in America, that the American government had a system of checks and balances, right? They were like, don't worry, democracy is safe because there's checks and balances. Yeah. But what they're doing is they're taking away all those checks and balances. And so what we have is, what can you believe anymore? Mm-hmm. Are you going to believe a talk show host, on a very fundamentalist, airwave? And I'm talking about fundamentalism on both sides of the line, right? We're talking about extreme right and extreme left. I mean, I'm talking about, fundamentalism and how it's manipulating all of us into believing that they are the truth. And I think that this is very dangerous, and we're in a very dangerous time right now. And having gone back to do extensive research on World War II, between the wars. Mm-hmm. So after World War I was a very ripe time for the Nazis to take over, because people were hurting economically, mm-hmm. right? The war, there were a lot of people who lost their jobs. So people were starving. The same kind of stuff that's happening now in this country. They couldn't find jobs. There was general malaise. And so that's when Hitler stepped in and said, I am your savior. I'm a man of the people. Why do you think there were pictures of him on the backs of trucks handing out loaves of bread to people to show that I care about you, when he didn't care about them at all? No. So, I saw the patterns of history back in the 30s up to now, and I see the same patterns happening. And that's why, with a film, when you think about the power of film to be able to remind people, mm-hmm. to take them to a situation where they can vicariously relive what that situation is.
Yeah.
So that's why I said to Kate, it's really important that we start the film in the late 30s, because exactly the same time, people did not believe that Hitler would become who he did. And they couldn't foresee the destruction of Europe. Everybody would say, oh, it's not going to be anything. Oh, he just became chancellor, where he manipulated himself becoming chancellor, right? So there are all of these things that are mirroring what's happening today. People are saying, oh, it's not going to be a big deal back in 2016. And I said, be careful, because that's exactly what happened in Nazi Germany. And we see, and it wasn't only, what happened, the war affected everybody's life.
Absolutely.
There were millions of people who were killed.
Yeah.
But when you look at the photographs and you go back and you look at World War II, it was destroyed. Dresden was flattened. You see cities that their entire rubble. Yeah. And that was what I was really interested in Lee Miller, because she was able to witness this firsthand when she was in World War II. She went to Europe. She wanted to do her part to take photographs to show people what had happened. And interestingly, when she brought those photographs back, people would say, oh, is this really true? And that's why when she wrote on the envelope to Audrey Withers, who was the editor of Vogue in London, they were publishing these stories about the war in a fashion magazine, right? Yeah. That's how radical these two women were. And she said to Audrey on the outside of the envelope, believe this, believe it. And so, you find, I think it so speaks to today and what's happening today in the world, that people are not believing what they're seeing. And, there's fake news, lies being told. There's peaceful protests going on around the country, and yet people are being arrested for peaceful protests, and it's being called that they're being insurrectionists, which is absolutely not the case. And we see that the journalists are being silenced, much like they were in Gaza, right? Killed and silenced, and they're being silenced here in this country. And you see it, and I'm just waiting for the next step, because they are trying to go as far as they possibly can. So the truth becomes up for grabs, right? What do you believe? Do you believe what somebody's telling you, who's known to be a pathological liar? Or do you believe, the journalists who are on the ground, who are impartial, who are just trying to show what's happening? They are the ones who are being silenced.
Believe what you see, not what they say.
Yes. And knowing that AI is here, that's a whole other aspect of our lives today.
I want to come to that, but I want to rewind the clock a little bit, because that's what we do on this show, Ellen. We take you back to some of the, where it all began for you, because it began in New Jersey, 1959, and you came from Polish ancestry. So I'm very interested in that, because politics is important to you, and clearly your ancestry is who you are.
Very much so. Yeah, my ancestry, I'm very much attached to my Polish background and my ancestry, but because my father was the first generation, my mother was the second generation, actually, but they spoke Polish at home.
Can you speak Polish?
I can speak a little Polish. Oh yeah, I grew up hearing it in the house, because when I was in high school, my grandmother came to live with us because my grandfather died. So I shared a room with my grandmother. And she could hardly speak any English.
So right there, we talk about politics, and you being from this Polish ancestry, I'm wondering how much the politics of your family influenced you when you were young and shaping your political viewpoints.
Very much so. My grandfather was an immigrant who came here to this country before World War I.
Okay.
Right. And my grandmother was 15. And she told my grandmother was 15. She told her mother the day before she was going to leave, she says, I'm going to America. And she left at 15 years old from a village near Krakow. And I don't know how she got to the boat, but obviously had no money. It was stowage, I'm sure. And how do you do that at the age of 15 and come to America? And she did. And my grandparents, my grandfather was very smart. He was really smart in math, but, he had no education. He had a little education, but they experienced extreme discrimination. I mean, it was prevalent back then, as you know, the Italians, the Irish, everybody all white, of course, but completely dumped upon. And, and I felt that as a child, that feeling of having been dumped on. My father was determined to succeed, determined. At the age of 7, went out to shine shoes so that he could help support the family. Now, my aunt, his older sister, was brilliant, as my father was brilliant. So when she graduated from high school, she was offered a full 4-year scholarship to study nuclear physics. And can you imagine? This is the early 40s.
Yes.
And nuclear physics was a time, she was brilliant, right?
And for a woman.
And for a woman. And the high school guidance counselor told her, girls don't do science. And he had a huge slur, Polish slur. And my grandfather was so upset. He's like, no, took her out of school. He was so upset. But that shaped my aunt ended up becoming a very accomplished accountant, but she never got paid what she would be the boss, and the people underneath her, the men, would get paid more than she would. That was something that really made a mark on me. And I was like, fuck that shit,
Was this on your father's side?
My father's side, but my mother's side actually is a more artistic side, believe it or not. My aunt, my mother's older sister, took photographs. She always had her little brownie camera with her. And I found a bunch of those photographs after she died. And I have them, and there's some really interesting shots in there. But the fact that she was an avid photographer, I never really thought about it until much later,
Yeah. What memories do you have of, interacting with your grandparents? Were you close to either set of grandparents? Did you have a favorite?
Yeah, we were very close. I mean, my grandmother, on my mother's side, I never knew my grandfather. He died before I was born, but she lived in Baltimore. So that was another thing that I think was interesting about the immigrant experience, was that my mother grew up in a Polish enclave in Baltimore, and she had her cousins and aunts and uncles all around her. And then when she met my dad, which they met in Maine on a boat, I think because they could both speak Polish and they both had similar backgrounds, they came together. She left her family to go live in New Jersey because my father was an engineer at ITT. And I realized only, years, just recently, how much my mother gave up to raise 4 kids by herself, with a husband who traveled all over the world, and she did it all on her own. And, to be not near her family was a huge thing, to have this huge extended family and to leave and to be without that, So, you only in your adulthood, you go back and you start thinking about, okay, you see your parents as people and how things have happened, I think a lot of us as kids, we don't see that. We just see them as our parents, and we don't see that, they're actual people. And I think, oh my God, what was my mother doing when she was my age? Or, you start thinking about, okay, so when I turned 40, what was my mother doing? She already had 4 kids, she had me when she was 28 and I was number 3. So you can imagine.
Your father was very accomplished, Ellen, as an engineer.
Yeah, very much so. He was a brilliant engineer. He was an entrepreneur, an innovator. He started out at ITT, which was International Telecommunications Company. It was kind of what Verizon is, or AT&T. And he then he wanted to start his own company, so he and about 6 other guys left ITT to start a company, but he was the boss. And I have to say, I look upon that little company that he made with a lot of pride, because he was beating out huge companies for contracts. So GE, Raytheon, giants in the field of electronics and avionics. So, and he was always, for me, the most important thing about my father is that he was a man of integrity. And just before he died, I asked him, I said, Dad, so what do you think your legacy is? And he said that I kept my integrity intact, because, people, they get buffeted by everything, by all these different forces. But he was always someone who cared about the people who worked for him. He always cared about people who struggled. My father was always about trying to help people. And I remember when he would tell me, he'd go to Taipei, because he was part of the defense there. He said that he spent a lot of his life helping to defend Taipei, to keep it independent. But he would go to a huge dinner with generals and admirals, and he would ask one of the translators to go into the kitchen, and he would go and talk to the workers in the kitchen. And he'd want to know, so how much do you make a week? Or, how many children do you have? And he would talk to the people in the kitchen. He was also very much into cooking, so he wanted to know what the cooking was as well. But that's the kind of person that my father was. He was a very generous, gregarious kind of person. And so that really influenced me. And I think in my career, I've always approached my crews and people with kindness, no matter what job they do. And I've always treated them with respect. And I see it again and again. And it doesn't matter if it's the film industry or wherever. As soon as people get into positions of authority or power, they start using that power, and they think they can start dumping on people who are working for them. And I've never done that. And I've always said to people, and said to students who are coming up, I said, you don't have to be an asshole to be good, right? So, kindness wins over so much more. And that's why I can go anywhere in the world and work, and people will want to work with me because they know that I treat them with respect and with kindness. And I really think that we've lost that in the world, and, comes from the top, leadership, and that if they say, oh, well, you can treat people badly and beat them up and beat the shit out of them and be a bully, then people think they have permission to do that. And I am counter that. I said, no, you don't. And I see the evidence of that all over the world, that people think that now they can treat people with disrespect and be bullies. And I'm sorry, but why are you doing that?
It's clear that those are values that you got from your father. I'm wondering about your relationship with your mother and what she taught you that you've appreciated later in life.
My mother was very much like that as well. I think that was something that my parents shared very deeply. A set of values that are about respect and kindness and helping people. My mother was very much like that as well. But I do say that, my father put a lot of pressure on me to get what he called a real job for years. And, very early in my career, I went off on a limb to buy a camera because I wanted to be a cinematographer. When I realized that, I had something, I really wanted to do that. And yet, so I went to the visual studies workshop. It's a long story, but I worked in a museum in my last year at college in Brown University. And I was really interested in how museums talk about people, right? And how museums are a reflection of the community. So there was this woman who took over this natural history museum, Marianne Cucini, I still remember her name. And she was a dynamite, but she believed in turning this museum around. Of course, you know, it was run by a bunch of old ladies who knew nothing. The curator was stealing all of the Native American artifacts and selling them on the black market. And so it was like, okay, stop all of that. You know, fired the guy. And we turned the museum into a community museum. So that's how I got to know the Southeast Asians, because I lived in a Cape Verdean neighborhood in Providence. And all of a sudden, all of these Hmong people were newly arrived, you know, so I'd see them in traditional clothes walking down the street with chickens. And, you know, I said, yeah, who are these people? You know, what's going on? And that's how I became much more aware of, this is right after the Vietnam War. So we're talking about 1980, you know, the war ended in 75, and then these refugees were coming, right? So so we made the museum into, a community museum where I then was programming. So I went to the community and I said, you know, if you loan me these beautiful batiks, which tell the story of the war, I'll put them in the museum. So I did a big, huge exhibition around Southeast Asian art with the people and brought them to talk with translators, had them sharing their crafts, and the Cambodians, the Hmong, the Vietnamese, everybody put, you know, their things together because I felt like if they see themselves in a museum, they're going to feel like they belong. And then I did it with Eastern European immigration, because that had happened many years before. So it's like we see the waves of immigration. And that's the thing I think, which is interesting about today, is that in America, it's like, guys, we are a country of immigrants. We come from immigrants. Even the president's family came from Scotland. And it's like, come on, you know, his wife wasn't born here. So there's a real hypocrisy going on in terms of doing that. And that's why I try to make my actions speak for what the meaning is. But anyway, so I don't know how I got off on that tangent about going to Providence, but yeah.
Let's go back a little bit, because I'm wondering what the young Ellen did when you were small. Did you play with your siblings? Were you particularly close to your older brother Jeff or your sisters?
I would say the most defining influence in my childhood was the fact that I grew up in a neighborhood where everybody knew everybody else. It was a cul-de-sac neighborhood. Everybody was from different countries, from all over, because, you know, that neighborhood was established in the 50s. So post-war, so we had neighbors from Germany. We had neighbors who, German neighbors, but German nationals. Next door was my best friend's family. She was a conservative Jew. Her father escaped from Nazi Germany as a child. And here you have two people living right next door to each other. We had Czechoslovakians down the hill. We had people from everywhere, all over the world in this neighborhood. And all the kids played together. And everybody knew each other, and we helped each other. And I have to say, it really made us feel a community. You know, it's like if I went up the street and, you know, somebody's mother was outside and we were being bad, she would come over and smack us, you know. But when there was a smacking able to be happening, but, you know, it's like everybody in the neighborhood was your parent.
Yeah.
And everybody watched over each other. And to me, that's what community is about. And, you know, today, I think that we have gotten away from that in America, people have become much more individualistic, and they care about themselves. And my father used to say, yeah, it's the tendency, hooray for me, the hell with you.
Yeah.
You know, and that I think is now defining America, as opposed to, for the most part, because I live in a community now, which is people help each other. But you find that in Japan, the collective and the community is important. Why do you think that people wear masks when they're sick? So that other people don't get sick. Yeah. So the fact that it became a huge deal in this country where, I don't want to wear a mask because they're being selfish, right? You don't care about the person who's next to you. And that's what America has become. It's like, I want my rights. Well, if I'm going to talk about rights, I want my right not to be shot, right? Yeah. If I'm going to talk about my personal rights, I have a right not to be shot. So how does that compare to your right? Right. So, I think that people only look at one side of the spectrum when it comes to rights, about what their rights are as opposed to what other people's rights are as well. That's a whole other discussion.
Did your parents lose any family members during World War II?
No, but my grandmother lost 3 children under the age of 7. So she lost 2 kids during the first pandemic, ages 2 and 3, which must have been devastating. I can't imagine. And then she lost a son, my father's older brother. And it's controversial, but I think that there were gangs of kids who used to rove around the rail yards, and they were hired by a gang boss to collect coal. And I think that he was killed by a train, and I think it had something to do with his being Polish. That I think he was that they pushed him. But that's my own opinion. But anyway, in terms of World War II, both of my mother's, one of my mother's brothers and my aunt's husband, my mother's sister's husband, went to World War II. And unbeknownst to me, they both were liberators of concentration camps. I didn't know this and find this out until had to be 3 months before my uncle died. My uncle by my aunt's husband. And he went as a 19-year-old and went to Germany and probably was in Torgau, the same thing as Lee Miller. And I didn't find this out until I gave a book to him that a friend of mine wanted to make into a film. It was about World War II. It's about a spy from World War II who uncovered the location of a lot of the concentration camps. And so I sent him this book and I said, so Uncle Carl, I said, did you get my book? Did you read it? And the book that I sent you, not my book, but the book. And he said, yeah. He said, I did. He says, I was there. I said, what do you mean you were there? He says, I was in Ordorf. He said, I liberated Ordorf. And that's how I met General Patton. I'm like, what? He said, yeah, I was there. I couldn't believe it. And I had wanted to interview him because I know that they had interviewed a lot of the liberators. And then he died and I didn't have a chance to. And I always regret that. I think, that goes to show you when people say, oh, I should do this or I should talk to that person, you do it because they're not going to last forever, So, and then I found out that my mother's brother, who was very close with my other uncle, that he was in the war. He was also at Torgau, which is when the Russians came together to meet the Americans, right? When they were in that final push to, overcome Nazi Germany. And he liberated Birkenau and Buchenwald. So it was like, oh my God, I can't believe that I never knew that. They never spoke about it. And interestingly, speaking about the truth, so my uncle had come across a fallen journalist, right, who was killed because there was still skirmishes and taking over the concentration camps. The German guards were still fighting. And there was a journalist who was killed, and my uncle saw that he had his camera. He took the film from the camera And so apparently, and I didn't know this until my cousin told me when I was doing research for Lee. And she said, oh, yeah. So he took that film. I said, did he develop it? She says, oh, yeah, there's pictures of the bodies from the concentration camp. And I said, oh, my God. So what did you do? What did he do with it? So I asked my mother and I said, Mom, do you remember when your brother came back from the war and he had these pictures? And she says, yeah. I said, did you see them? And she goes, yeah, we were horrified. She said, but we didn't believe it. She said, he showed it to the neighbors. Nobody believed that it was true. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting. This is empirical evidence. And they still didn't believe it because it was so horrific. Anyway, I think that a lot of people have a history that intersects their lives, but they have never gone into the past to look. They've never asked their parents or their grandparents what happened. And I think all of us have lessons to be learned from history. Obviously the last of the people from World War II are now dying off. They're in their late 90s. And those stories need to be told still. We need to remember. And obviously, in this country, people are not remembering the lessons of history. And yeah.
Clearly. I'm wondering if there's a memoir waiting to be written. Have you ever thought of writing your own memoir?
Yeah, I've been so busy,
But one day.
Yeah, I think it would be interesting because I feel like I've seen a lot and I've experienced a lot and I've been all over the world and I've been able to see how people are. And people are very similar all over the world. I mean, you see, even in the film industry, if I go down to Argentina, all of the camera assistants are very the same. They're like the ones in Hollywood, The person who's doing the lighting is very similar to the person who's doing the lighting in Hollywood. I mean, it just makes me laugh because I'm like, it's the same kind of personality type that get drawn to him. But people, are this, we're the same all over the world. And we, whether you go from an indigenous person who's fighting for their right to their land in Latin America, that their land is being taken away from them because of water or mining or whatever. It's the same here in this country. Can you imagine if somebody came into this, upstate New York and tried to take your land forever, which is eminent domain, which they have? I mean, there would be outrage. So, part of our society is predicated on who has the loudest voice, and who can be heard. And I think that that's one of the reasons why I think for me, film is really important because, we're able to speak, we're able to give voice to stories that would never be seen before, whether it's a documentary or a political film, we see these films coming out much more now.
I want to talk about art and your very early art influence. And I read somewhere that you, in the early days, enjoyed sculptures, very much caught your eye. Talk a little bit about, if you would, those sort of artistic heroes that you were influenced with turning your head when you were very small. What were your very earliest memories of art and the power of art?
I would say, interestingly, I'd have to say it had to do with the ancient world. I was really interested in the ancient world, in Sumer, Mesopotamia, the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, Egypt. I was really fascinated as to, the kind of art that we would see there, hieroglyphics was fascinating to me as a pictorial way of communicating, cuneiform. So what does that mean? How do you get meaning from that? They were trying to put together meaning. When you look at the hieroglyphics, it's like this meaning, that meaning, this meaning, So I was kind of fascinated with that. And I was also fascinated with the texture of the ancient world, and the color. And then I think, for me, sculpture is something I've been very tactile with my hands. But I think when you look at sculpture and space, and you think about space in a different way, and how an object takes up a space, or how does it manifest? What does it say about our space? And I think when I first saw the early work of Marina Abramovich, I was really taken by what she was doing. There were other artists at the time, when we were talking the 70s, that were working with earth, that were taking sculpture to a completely different place than it just being a physical, literal manifestation of an idea. When you look at Leonardo da Vinci, the way that he would depict his sculpture was much more realistic. But he was also someone who explored ideas and space and how things display space and that kind of thing. But but it wasn't until modern times that I was just influenced by it. And I would go to the library and spend hours and hours in the library, and just love being in the open stacks and just going to the art department and just sitting there on the floor and looking through all of these books and being influenced by what I was seeing, painting, and was interested in light and dark. But it had never occurred to me that actually I could do that as a profession. My father was very much on the straight and narrow of, be a lawyer, doctor, or whatever,
Did they take you to galleries and museums?
No, never. But they did take us to restaurants. My father was one of the original foodies, and he was very much into Asian cooking. Or any kind of cooking. He loved cooking from around the world. My brother also was very much into cooking. My brother, when he was in high school, would grind his own curries for Indian food. But, we would go, and this is at a different time in New York, where New York had markets. I remember Ninth Avenue used to be full of these markets where you could go and you'd see bags of spices outside, much like you still see in Europe, or you see in the Middle East, or in Morocco, where the spice guy is out there. So that was very much about New York. We would go to the Lower East Side. My father would talk to the Shimmy's pickles guy and go and you'd get pickles in a barrel, right? And we were always going to all the markets, the food markets, and he would take us once a month to go try a new Chinese restaurant or a different kind of dish in Chinatown. So I knew Chinatown really, really well, as a child.
Does that mean you're a good cook? Are you interested in cooking too?
I do love cooking, but you have to have time to cook, and I'm not home a whole lot, but I do like cooking. At a certain point, I was doing like 8-course Chinese meals when I was in college, but just being really interested in it's a form of art, cooking. It's a form of putting together flavors and that kind of thing. So. But I do remember distinctly when I was a kid, we would be driving away from the city, and I watched the World Trade Centers being built, through the back window of the station wagon.
What other interest did you have as a child growing up, though, when, just your early childhood and then in your teenage years? Did you do any sports or anything like that?
Oh, yeah, very much so. So I was doing all the sports I could. So this was before Title IX. So before women were allowed to be in sports, right? Or before women's sports were recognized. So from the time I was in 6th grade, I played softball. I played everything. I played basketball, field hockey, softball. That's all they had at the time. Right. There was no volleyball, no soccer, nothing. It was just field hockey, softball, and basketball. And I played all three. And we were really good. Our softball team was 60-0 when we graduated from high school. It was the same group of girls who went through. I went to public high school, and we won the state championship. And you know, it was also another, I think, way for me to embody community. You know, when you're a team member and also being leadership. So having leadership experience, because I was often the captain on the team, and, you know, and that involves leadership, and that, you know, you have to, you know, take your team through. And I saw when I was on set, you know, as a director or a cinematographer, you are the leader.
Once a captain, always a captain.
True.
I could see that. It's a constant thread through your life. But the one thing I want to talk about, because it has shaped, obviously, how you see the world, is that you had a hearing loss as a small child. Yes. From illness. How did you become aware of it, and how it would translate into who you became and what you did for a living?
I think it had a huge influence on me. I mean, it influences everything I do, even today. And, you know, they didn't discover that I had a hearing problem until I was 4, and I was in kindergarten, and my teacher would call me with my back turned and I wouldn't turn around. So she told my mother, and that started a whole kind of inquiry as to what had happened. They think that when I was an infant, I probably had a high fever, because in those days they didn't have the same kind of ways of dealing with it, you know, you know, that at that time, hearing loss was associated with, you know, you were considered more stupid. I mean, it's a disability in some ways. And, you know, I look at today where they fired all those people who are in the disability department in the Department of Education, and I think, oh my God, you know, it's so stupid. But I got hearing aids as a child, which I hated. You know, the hearing aids were completely different than they are now. And so I refused to wear them. And, you know, what's interesting about being part of the partially deaf world and the hearing world is that people don't know that I have a hearing loss. So if you don't hear someone when they're talking, because a lot of people mumble, is that they think you're stupid. You know, you say, excuse me, and they think it's because you're stupid, not because you can't hear them. So for years, you know, there's this kind of attitude of, you know, oh, you're stupid. But I knew I wasn't stupid. You know, I was top of my class when I graduated. You know, it's just, you know, I knew that I knew better. But as a child, you feel that discrimination. You feel that judgment. And I think I had to fight that my whole life. You know, and I know that, you know, it's like people don't realize that you're deaf. And it was only until much later as an adult, I would say, no, if you speak a little more clearly, then I can hear you, because I can't hear you, you know, so to throw it back on someone else. But I think that there's a lot of people in the world who can't hear, and it's a stigma. And the reason why it's a stigma is because early on, people thought that hearing was seen as a disability and that you weren't perfect. And that also they associated hearing loss with retardation, mental retardation. And that has been something that has carried through, because I have very good friends who have hearing loss and they don't want to wear hearing aids. I'm like, you don't understand how much you're missing. You know, don't let the stigma of it overcome you. And I have to say, my life was changed because the hearing aids were never up to snuff. You know, the technology was way behind. So when I was doing Eternal Sunshine, for example, and I would have my hearing aid in my ear with the camera very close to my ear, because we handheld the whole movie, there would be feedback. So the sound person would say, what is that sound? You know, so I'd have to take my hearing aid out because otherwise I was causing sound because they weren't, the technology hadn't caught up yet. So also I knew as a filmmaker, I wanted to be a filmmaker before I became a cinematographer. And I realized I have to hear, you have to be able to hear. And it was, for me, something that held me back in a real way. And that when I went into cinematography, it was a safe place to be because I could be behind the camera. I could zone out all of the crazy madness around me. And I could just be in my head and look at what's going on through the viewfinder. And I was in my own world and I loved being there. But I did know that I had more to say. I wanted to say more. I wanted to go back to being a director and being a filmmaker. So it wasn't until I got asked by Marty Scorsese to follow Bill Clinton in Africa on his global initiative tour. It was a CGI, right? Clinton Global Initiative, which was a great thing, which I witnessed firsthand when I went to go and follow Bill with the camera to see what he was doing there. And, he was making such a difference there because he was providing programs to enable people to help themselves. So he was really reversing colonialism in a real way, right? Like in Rwanda, he said to, it's like, if Starbucks would buy a month of Rwandan coffee, it would help the people, the farmers, to have a distribution outlet. Then they could help them get the country back on its feet, right? So when I was there, one part of CGI, which was really important, was that he was friends with this guy who ran the Starkey Corporation, right? Or who was the head of it, this Bill, who would take a team of his audiologists and would go to with the team around Africa. And they went all over the world, Clinton Global Initiative, but I went with them in Africa. And so I distinctly remember every time we would go to we'd be at a hotel. So let's say we would be, at of course, the fanciest hotel in Addis Ababa, right? But on the lawn would be 200 chairs opened up. And in those seats would be these villagers who would come, and all of them would have hearing aid molds in their ears, right? And you're talking people from all walks of life, right? Poor people, all walks of life, all ages, right? So then they would invite the person up to the little place where they had like maybe 5 audiologists, and on the table next to them would be these hearing aids, right? And so they'd sit the person in the chair and they would put a hearing aid into the tube. And, they were all over the ears, and you would see the person go to the person, ba ba ba, no reaction, right? So they go to the next highest amplification, right? The hearing aid that had the next amplification, ba ba ba, no reaction. Then they go to the highest one, the strongest hearing aid that there is. And I'm talking a 60-year-old woman, right, who's deaf her whole life. Right? They put it in and they go, bah, 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 and you see this woman's eyes open up and she goes, bah, bah, bah. And you see people hear for the first time ever, time and time again, little kids, old men, and you see how they give them the gift of hearing. And it really is so moving, and you see this when they see it's like a blind person seeing for the first time. So I went to them and I'm like, hey, you guys, I said to Bill, I said, I have a hearing problem. And he said, you do? And I said, yeah, I have 80% loss in this ear, my right ear, which is a lot, and 20 in the other ear. And he says, oh, come see me. So he says, I'll give you some hearing aids. So I went to go see him at the Starkey Corporation in Minneapolis, outside of Minneapolis. And he fitted these hearing aids, and they were in the ear hearing aids, and they were kind of the newest, latest technology. And he said, I fit all the presidents, right? He said, these are the same hearing aids as the president. And I cannot tell you, my life was changed. It was like I had a whole other awareness of the world. I could hear things I could never hear before. Like, you know, I'm out here in the country and my friends would say, oh, did you hear that owl? No. Oh, did you hear those coyotes? No. But with these hearing aids, I could hear them. I felt like the world opened up around me. And that's why I think that, you know, for a lot of people who are afraid of getting hearing aids, because it's a stigma, because they feel like something's wrong with them, you know, they're missing so much. It's not a stigma, you know. I almost felt like, oh, give me ones that are hot pink. Let me just announce it and go, you know. But I think that's the way it has to be, you know, with that kind of thing. That is how society works in terms of, you know, trying to make people feel badly about themselves when it's unnecessary, you know. And I think that the disabled world, you know, do confront that every single day. It's that judgment that you're not perfect. And believe me, I tried to be perfect for a long time. And I realized it doesn't work.
Obviously, colour and light are critical senses, and I'm wondering which you see first when you look at a scene. Is it the light or the colour?
Very interesting question, because for me, it has to do with the feeling. And very much the feeling. And that was one reason why I was really interested in exploring meaning, which is, I went to Brown to be an Egyptologist. And after I took a photography class my second year, because I realized I could take classes at Rhode Island School of Design, which is where I really wanted to be, you know, I could take 2 classes a year, and it opened up my world in a different way. And I realized I wanted to get into the visual world, like photography and film. And I was interested in this idea of propaganda, even way back when. So I went to France to study for a whole year, to study structural linguistics and also meaning, because the French were very much involved in the course of study called la sémiologie. Right. La sémiologie was, as we know, as semiotics, but it's really the study of meaning. So that's what I was really interested in so what makes a photograph meaningful? What colors do you perceive first? What light? How does light work on your perception to be meaningful? And it's something that is interesting because it's not something you can really codify, you know, or say, oh yeah, well, the light was streaking through here and it had that certain feeling. Although if people look at the photograph of Grand Central Station, you know, in the 19th century, when the light was streaming through those windows, it has a certain feeling, which also I think mirrors in nature. But there are certain colors too, which affect us emotionally. You know, yellow is different than cyan or green or blue, or, you know, the secondary colors influence us differently than the primary colors. Like I have an affinity for certain colors. I really like, you know, secondary colors more than the primary colors. But if you're a painter, you might want to work more in, you know, bold primary colors. So it really has to do with, I think, personal taste and flavor, but also I do think that art is influenced by cultural opinion and norms as well. When you think about, you know, some of the painters who were, you know, seen as horrible painters in their day, and now their canvases are going for millions of dollars, you know. So, you know, it's about trend, but it's also about people appreciating, you know, the work for its certain intrinsic value, or, you know. So I think for me, I think I'm influenced by all of that. It's really hard for me to watch a film without analyzing it as it goes along, not only for its look, but for the performances and just talking about going back to childhood influences. I was really interested in theater when I was in high school. So I was also doing plays, acting in plays. And that's a whole other experience. When you think about getting into the mind's eye of a character, becoming a character, it really said to me a lot about emotion and taking on the emotion of a certain character. And that character, is able to convey a certain feeling to you. It's very interesting. And, it has to do with, the portrayal of it and that, the actor behind them, because I think then an actor can become a character, but at the same time that they're still present. Look at Diane Keaton, who just passed away. She was very much Diane Keaton, but she would become these other characters and you would believe those characters. And that was so delightful about the range of her work.
Did that give you confidence then when you were doing theatre in school, Ellen? And I'm wondering, because you had that hearing impairment, how it might have influenced you because of the things you just said as a child, and going into that world and becoming another character. Where did that confidence come from? Was it there before you went onto the stage, or did acting give you that confidence?
I think acting gave me that confidence because I had to feel it. You have to know what it feels like to go out there. It's not easy. Stage fright is always, not always there, but it was there. But I realized, because I've spoken a lot in front of audiences now during the course of my whole career, is that what propels me forward is the intention of what I want to say. So that's the most important thing, is to try and convey that message or whatever one is saying, and I suppose for actors, the ability to be able to, allow that character to come forth is what's tantamount. It was very funny because in Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, which is a film that, much beloved by many people, when we were making it, Michelle said to me, goes, Ellen, I want to put you in the movie. And I'm like, no. I just, I'm behind the scenes. I was the cinematographer on that film, and very engaged in every part of the making of that film. And so when he said, I want to put you in there, I just couldn't imagine, and he says, oh no, I want to put you behind this door, so when the camera comes around, then, we think it's going to be Kate, and it opens it up and it's you. And so, I was hand holding the whole movie. So I had to ask my B camera operator to do this big, long single shot, right? I go to hair and makeup, I get, the deal. And I realized that when I was standing there behind the door, because the camera had to come through the door, Jim had to come through, it's this long hallway shot where the camera is leading him, and he goes through and he goes to talk to the doctor, and he has a different wardrobe on, and then you swing around, and whenever the camera would come through, I'd have to push the camera in a way because it kept on hitting the door frame. So I'd wait for it and push the camera through, and then the door would close and I would be behind the door. And I swear it was an existential crisis, because I'm standing there in the darkness going, oh my God, what am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to look? What is my face? And I suddenly realized, I'm glad I'm not an actor, And then in the end, he ended up making all of our faces some sort of mass of flesh anyway, so I didn't have to worry about that, but I had no idea, But I realized the absolute terror of what it means to be an actor sometimes.
That was a different pathway at a different time.
Yeah, very much so.
I'm wondering now where you find your validation? Because often I ask painters, sculptors, is it when they finish the work in the studio, or is it when it's shown to the public? Where does the validation come for you? Because there's also the awards too that give you further validation. But is it when you wrap? At what point do you feel that is the work and I validate it myself?
I think it's probably it happens while we're on set sometimes, where when you're creating a scene. And I know that as a director now, when the scene falls into place, there's a sense that we did something good. We made meaning out of what were words on a page, which is really incredible to me. When you think about, you take a blank page and you put words on it, or the writer puts words on it, and then you take those words and you're able to take and create this whole scene around it and create something real and tangible. For me, that's the magic of cinema, where it started from just this black and white on the page. And I think I felt that too when I was shooting, when there's a certain kind of feeling that comes out of what you've created in front of you with the light, with the camera. And I remember as a cinematographer, often when everybody would be ready on set, everyone, the actors, the dolly grip, me, the gaffer, the sound people, everybody, when the director would say action, all of a sudden the wheels start turning and you're all in this other world for that time. And it's really interesting because then you say cut, it's like, okay, there's that sense of relief. And I would always run the camera a little bit longer. It's because the actors would always stay in character, that extra beat. And sometimes there was a moment there that was really beautiful or usable, or they would look. But there was that sense of the magic that happens in that, of creation, everybody coming together in synchronicity to create that scene.
Where is the joy for you today, not just at work, but at play?
I have to say, I think if I wasn't in the film industry, I think I would be in animal rights. I really... I'm so connected to animals, and, we humans forget that we are animals, and the way that we treat animals as lesser beings, but they're actually a lot smarter than we are in many ways. And, so I feel like I get a lot of joy from experiencing the animal world, and I wish I could do more to protect them from us, from humans. But also I've been, I love seeing films. Now it's Oscar time and I'm a governor in the Academy. And so I'm very involved with, helping people to see films and watching films. And, every time I walk out of a film, I'm a changed person. It enables me to see something else about life or the world. And I really enjoy family. I'm trying to spend more time with family. It's hard in the film industry because, the industry requires a huge commitment and passion and time. It's not like we have regular hours at all. Like you can't predict when you're going to come home because you could be on set for 3 more hours. But there's the joy in making something. But I think there's also the balance of trying to find, when you can say no to something so that you can spend more time with family. And that's the hardest thing, because when we're in a freelancer's life, it's harder to do that, because as a freelancer, you think, okay, when is my next job? Am I going to work again? And I'm really lucky because I have the option of saying no. But a lot of people don't, especially now, with the economic situation the way it is, the film industry has been pretty hit hard.
What's missing in your life?
I want to direct more films. I want to direct another film. So that I think is my next goal is, it takes a long time to develop a film and to get it going.
As you know from your first experience.
Yes, it just does. Everybody who makes a film, it's a miracle. So, I mean, it really is. So I want to do that next. And I want to go see more art. I want more time to take things in rather than always getting it out.
So going to see art, then exhibitions, showings, galleries. You must know a lot of artists whose work you admire. Are you a collector?
I have. I wish I had become a photography collector. In fact, actually, one thing that I do want to do is I have a wooden 8x10 camera, still photography. And I bought some sheet film for it. Each negative is very big. And I wanted to start taking some photographs with this old 8x10 camera. So I think I want to go and do a series about the farmers, the dairy farmers who are still in existence here in upstate New York, because, it's a legacy that's dying out because of big agriculture. These mega companies are taking over, and so family farms are all disappearing fast. So I think I want to go and do a series on that. So I want to do kind of more personal work at the same time.
Lots to do, Ellen.
Lots to do.
We're going to hop over to YouTube now, and I've got a few fun questions to ask you. But for here on the podcast, Ellen, thank you so very much for being my guest. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Chris. It's been a pleasure.
And if you hop over to our YouTube channel, The Art Podcast, you'll find a 50-minute video where Ellen shares more thoughts of her philosophies and her values. And we also have some fun too, when Ellen reveals the 6 guests, living or dead, who she would invite to dinner and what they would talk about. So do join us there on the YouTube channel. And don't forget that if you scroll down the show notes below the podcast player, you'll find the full transcript of this episode, as well as links relating to this podcast. And don't forget you can reach us via email too at theartpodcast@gmail.com. Don't forget that's art with 2 A's. And if you've enjoyed this episode, please do share it with others who you think might enjoy the show too. My thanks again to my guest this week, Ellen Kuras, and to you for listening. I'll be back in 2 weeks' time when my guest will be the multimedia installation artist Lori-Ann Minicozzi. So I do hope you'll join me then.